Okay, Niall's going to give his presentation. At the end, there'll be the opportunity to ask questions, and we'll be taking questions from online also. So we'll let Niall give his presentation as we do lectures and live, and then afterwards take some time for questions. So are we online yet?
Yeah, and it's back.
Okay, and welcome to people online. Warm in this room, which is why I'm wearing a t-shirt. And I'll hand over to Niall Curry, who will be talking to us about methods in function to form corpus linguistics. This is a repeat of a talk you gave recently at Anna Markey's Pertinora workshop. Over to you.
Thank you so much for having me and for coming along to this talk today. And as Tony said, I'll be talking a little bit about methods in function to form corpus linguistics, thinking a little bit about how we find function or how we find meaning within a corpus. This, might seem initially like I'm going to give you all of the secret tips and answers to how we do this. I'm not. It's very hard and it's not entirely possible, but we can try and get as close to it as we can. So what is the kind of context of this talk? So largely what I'm talking about is kind of this intersection between form to function approaches, function to form approaches, and where this kind of overlaps with notions of corpus pragmatics. And if we think about corpus linguistics, traditionally we take this kind of vertical reading methodology where we kind of work through texts, working down through concordance lines, looking to the right and left in order to be able to get context. And in function to form studies, this isn't particularly helpful because often what we need to do is be able to look a little bit more horizontally, and we need to be able to look in the context, but also the broader context of the text that we're looking at in order to be able to find out what's actually happening. So corpus pragmatics in this sense is concerned with not just this vertical approach, but also this horizontal approach to being able to identify a function in a corpus. But the problem fundamentally is that it's very difficult to retrieve that information from a corpus because we're typically quite form driven. And what we often have is a case of methodological circularity, where we search for form, find form, and then form is the answer to our question. But with that, we're not necessarily being able to open ourselves up to thinking about other ways of approaching this kind of this issue of being able to find meaning in a corpus. And so when I approached this, initially as part of my PhD research, I wondered, okay, are we the first people really to encounter this problem? And the answer is, as you may expect, no. So this kind of issue of methodological circularity is quite apparent in function to form studies in different fields. And in contrastive linguistics, so I was doing work in kind of multilingual contexts. In contrastive linguistics, this has actually been quite a problem in kind of what has like inevitably been a pattern of success, decline, success. In contrastive linguistics, where issues of methodological weaknesses made people turn away from contrastive approaches because what we were finding was quite circular. So, for example, Chesterton talks about the idea of putting the cart before the horse in contrastive linguistics. And there's a nice example in Kresarovsky's work in 1990, where he talks about comparing shapes. He says if we were to compare a square and a rectangle, but just compare it based on angles, what we would find is that these two things are the same. So if that is our point of comparison, we'd come to the conclusion reasonably that squares and rectangles are the same thing, when obviously we know that they're not. So we've got these kind of methodological pitfalls that we fall into when we're kind of approaching this kind of functional analysis. And I guess within the context of contrastive linguistics, this is really important because when we think about function and form, they're not necessarily always constrained in the same way as we work across languages. So when we want to look across languages, we need to be as open as possible because what form is performing a function in one language might not be doing the same thing in another. And so we need to think broadly. And so this has been a problem in contrastive linguistics for some time. So in corpus linguistics, what have we done? Well, what we've typically done in corpus pragmatics is we've taught a little bit about this kind of approach to looking around forms. So we look at forms and we look at the functions that orbit those particular forms. And so this might be through looking at pragmatically annotated corpora. It might be through sampling and sifting of corpora, so kind of getting into smaller, fine-grained analysis, or bottom-up analyses based on previous searches. So we might think of word lists that are extracted from different kinds of studies and how we might use those in order to be able to inform some kind of functional analysis. And I think within this particular space, we're something that I think is maybe counter to a lot of the discourses in corpus linguistics generally, is to do with size. So often we talk about corpora needing to be big. We see this kind of like interrelation with notions of big data. We need to have more and more and more. But actually, in the case of this kind of functional analysis and contrastive analysis that's deeply contextualized, smaller corpora are often better. So I'm always kind of campaigning for small corpora. They have their value, and they help us do a little bit more and control for variables, which is a well-established kind of understanding. So what I tried to think about, okay, so this is our approach in corpus pragmatics. How would this work across languages, and what kind of things would we do when we work across languages? And really, this is for me in the sense of what I was trying to do. But the premise here is really that what we can do is we can draw on theoretical approaches that come from comparable disciplines or related disciplines that maybe help us tackle these issues that we're trying to tackle even within a monolingual study, for example. And what I found was that these particular notions of contrastive linguistics overlapped or interrelated very neatly with concepts that are foundational in corpus linguistics. So we have this idea of tertium comparationis, which is a comparable common ground, some kind of assumed common ground. And in the case study that I'll share with you, that common ground is that questions are a feature of research article texts in each language, right? In English, French, and Spanish in my case. So that was what I assumed to be comparable. And then what we do is we test that comparability in order to be able to see to what degree and in what ways this is true. And so that might be thinking about things like form, whether it uses similar types of questions, forms of questions, whether we have similar lengths of questions, whether they occur in similar parts of the text, whether they serve the same functions, etc. And this list can just go on and on and on. One of the kind of challenges of contrastive linguistics is that in theory it never ends, right? So you're on a cycle and you're constantly reinterrogating the same ideas, but if that were the case, that you'd never write anything down. So eventually you have to kind of call it a day and start again with something new. But the idea is really about reinterrogating based on these notions of equivalence. And when we think about how this maps against corpus linguistics, for example, we might think of the tertium comparationis and this kind of comparable common ground as something that helps us design corpora with regards to comparability. So how comparable are the texts? How many texts do I need? What should be the makeup of these texts? In terms of disciplinary variation, if you're looking at academic texts, is economics the same in English, the same in French, the same in Spanish, and so on. So we use this as a way to be able to build something comparable. And then we use this to see whether we did, in fact, build something comparable and how those things then correspond as we move across languages. So with this in mind, what I thought about was how can we bring together notions of corpus pragmatics, notions from corpus linguistics, and notions from contrastive linguistics to help us address this kind of functional approach in corpus-based approaches.
Sorry.
Oh, did it disappear?
No, it disappeared for a second.
You just got a little question mark. So the case today I'm going to talk about is looking at questions, meta-discourse, and academic writing in English, French, and Spanish. And I'm going to maybe talk through in kind of a broad way, but if you want to be able to read it in a little bit more detail, you'll find it published earlier this year in IJCL. So I'll share the slides around and you can get the citation if you're interested. So what am I talking about? So I'm talking about questions. The idea behind this was that I wanted to look for something that I thought was a feature that was shared across languages and that was performing some kind of function. So questions as a rhetorical feature of texts in academic research articles, for example, are a strategy of dialogical involvement. So it's a way in which we can include readers in texts, position readers in texts, and manipulate kind of readers' kind of perspectives and perceptions in texts. And broadly, they can deal with a lot of different functions in the way that they're kind of enacted. So, for example, we could think about how they might be able to address reader reactions. We might anticipate some critique. So we might raise a question in order to be able to address the critique we anticipate and then move on, or to position readers discursively, as I noted. And they do a lot more. When we look at research on direct questions in research article texts, for example, we see that they can be used to generate emotion. They can be used to question certainty of particular scientific findings, to express a dubious nature of results. Often they're kind of critiqued as a sense of something informal in texts, and referred to as things like clickbait in academia, so a way to try and pull you in. Incidentally, it works because the studies show that papers with questions in their titles are often more cited and more read. So there you go. So it can often create interesting titles as well. I think it like taps into the human condition of not wanting doubt, right? So you raise a question, and you're like, goodness, what was the answer to that question? And you dive in and you answer the question. So questions kind of serve a lot of different rhetorical functions. Very rarely, in fact, are questions actually asking questions, right? More often they're serving some kind of rhetorical function in academic texts. And what you see with this research is that it's often quite constrained to direct questions. For obvious reasons, we can search for question marks, right? Question marks are easy to find in a text. And they act as a form of illocutionary force indicating device, so they signal to the reader that a question is being asked. It's an efficient way to get all direct questions, but we have to think, I guess, about cross-cultural perspectives and different ways, maybe disciplinary and linguistic conventions around question raising. For example, thinking about notions of indirectness and whether or not certain cultures might be more inclined to raise questions indirectly, or whether there's a relationship between what questions are doing and the degree of explicitness or implicitness in the question raising. As I mentioned, most studies focus on direct questions, so we see very few studies that actually address indirect questions, and it's because they're hard to find. There's no one thing you can search for that pulls out all the indirect questions. But if we go back to the 70s, people did try to hack this in some way. And Cartooner proposes these kind of use of verbs used to raise questions indirectly. So often used with things like WH clauses and things like if or whether clauses. We see these kind of verbs like to know, to be aware, to recall, to learn, to notice, or we might see things like interrogative verbs, like or inquisitive verbs, you know, here. Ask, wonder, investigate, etc. So these are things that can be used to identify indirect questions in a way. But again, what we have is something that's a bit formally constrained. In Romero, he talks about this notion of concealed questions. And so I found this quite useful as a way of thinking about it. So what constitutes a question? Is a question its form, or is it what it's trying to do within the text? And in this, he knows the idea of a concealed question are questions that don't typically use question words or question embedding words, but it's actually related more to what they're doing in the text. So they might raise some doubt and address some doubt. So really what we need is a lot of context to decide what constitutes a question. And the only study I was able to find that actually addressed this in some way was Blagojevich's paper in 2012, where they included this notion of indirect questions in their analysis of academic writing, but it was constrained to questions composed with WH or if-whether clauses. So again, we have this kind of formal constraint in terms of what we're searching for. And when we think about this, I guess we might wonder, what would such a corpus analysis show me? But also, what would it miss? What might we be missing if we are looking in this way? So what I did was I kind of worked with this multilingual corpus, and I wanted to extract all the questions and try and see if I could get access to these embedded, concealed questions within the texts. And so in the end I did, and I found, I'll explain the process that I went through to kind of get at these figures, but I used a corpus of English, French and Spanish, 50 research articles in each one. The English and French came from the KIA corpus, which is a multilingual corpus of English, French and Norwegian across multiple disciplines, and I made the Spanish corpus in a comparable way to theirs. And so I found generally there was a bit of a decrease in question usage across these languages from English to French to Spanish, but evidently questions are used in all three languages as well, which is the main takeaway. And so what I did was I tried to identify questions through question marks as IFIDs and illocutionary force indicating devices. So how do foreign patent rights affect US exports? But also things like concealed questions. And in this case, it's not clear whether inflation rises or falls was the form of a concealed question, where this actually was the research question that guided the study, and then they moved to answer this in a way. So does inflation rise or fall? So falling into this category as a concealed question. And within this, I faced a lot of problems because I was trying to compare across these languages, and there were so many variables that I couldn't really figure out how to bring all of this together and make something meaningful out of it. So for example, even if we think about comparing academic English to any other languages like French or Spanish, such differing publishing cultures, very different audiences for the texts, and written for very, very different purposes. And even though we have things like, maybe in this case, I was looking specifically at economics texts in each language, whether or not those economics texts were actually dealing with the same disciplinary area is questionable, in that when we look across institutions, we constitute disciplines in different ways. When we look across cultures, we constitute disciplines in different ways. Sometimes they're joined together, sometimes they're moved apart. It's often political. So what actually fits into a discipline is a bit intangible at times. Similarly with the genre, so they were research articles in each language, but are they the same? Is a research article in French the same as a research article in Spanish the same? Just because they have the same name doesn't mean they're necessarily the same thing. And within this, then, what we have is different kinds of ways of approaching knowledge dissemination and construction. So what goes into the text may be suffering from different kinds of impact of English on it. So there may be seeing kind of Anglicization of approaches to being able to disseminate information, or we may be seeing some kind of counter to it as well. So academic culture and tradition are a factor too. So a lot of variables, and we're trying to compare across these texts. And this was important because if I was trying to find function, and I was trying to find the way that these things were happening differently, it was important that I was able to reconcile all of these challenges to make something meaningful out of the findings that I produced. Otherwise, it might be different because they're very different. And then it's not a particularly interesting finding, is it? So how did I address this? So what I moved to do was I tried to bring corpus and contrastive linguistic approaches together by addressing this notion of the tertium comparationis and equivalence, and aligning it with these notions of representativeness and sampling that are quite foundational in our approach. And I looked at discipline as a way to be able to constrain variables. So I was just talking about economics. And when I defined this notion of economics, I also looked particularly for certain kinds of economic texts. So I looked for kind of theoretical economics texts, and I set certain parameters that are explained in, actually not in the paper, but in the original work by Kia, by Flottenmetal, because I basically mirrored their corpus construction in order to make it comparable. I can tell you it's page 16 of the book, so, so it's in there if you're interested. And I tapped into this notion of discourse community and disciplinary genre as a way to be able to also set further parameters. But this was tricky because I wasn't sure if it was a discourse community initially. I wasn't sure whether or not these things could actually be compared because they don't talk to each other. People publish papers in French on economics, and in the citations you might see references to papers published in English, but papers published in English very rarely will have citations of anything published in any language other than English. So they're not necessarily actually co-constructing knowledge as a community. So I was like, is this a discourse community? And then I happened upon this very useful derivation by Swales of his initial notion of discourse community, where he splits discourse community into two comparable, or two kind of distinct rather, concepts. One is a place discourse community, which kind of refers back to his original 1990 notion of a discourse community. And then a focus discourse community, which is the notion that we're joined together by shared practices. So it taps into notions related or coming from communities of practice in a way, but focusing still on the discourse. So we may be writing similar types of texts for a similar type of purpose, trying to do similar types of things. We don't necessarily have to talk to each other, but we engage in similar academic practices. And so that helped me kind of conceive of this as a shared community that was trying to do something with language in order to be able to share information, etc. And then within that, then the idea was to try and pull out this information that made it, that helped us access how questions were formed. So this was, I guess, a lot of the groundwork done in order to actually determine whether or not I could pull anything out that was meaningful. And then as part of the study, what I did was I compared English, French, and Spanish questions in terms of a bunch of different criteria. So I looked at frequency, I looked at function. I built on Highland's 2002 concept of, I think it's 7 functions of question. this was something that I had to kind of iteratively apply and then kind of reconceptualize, because his study was applied only to English, and I wanted to be open to other ways of being able to frame and ask questions that came from other languages as well. I looked at things like question length, question type and form. So question type is the notion of whether it was direct or indirect, and form would be a content question, like a WH question, a yes/no question, an alternative question, a declarative question, elliptical question, and so on. So kind of breaking down into these different categories. Where they occurred, intro, mid, conclusion. Not the mid section, I guess, was not particularly revealing. Most questions occurred in the middle. Middle sections were often longer, so not a particularly interesting finding. As I moved into further analysis that I'll explain, the sectioning became important. This was, I guess, one of the characteristics that comes as is part of these kinds of contrastive studies, because often we have to zoom out a little bit to be able to get a comparable common ground. And the structure of research articles in different languages was very different. So you couldn't really map one simple structure that worked across. And so we followed this kind of approach of intro, mid, conclusion. Looked at things like tense, aspect, verbal modality, to be able to see whether or not there were different ways of phrasing, and also different sentence types. So I had 4 categories of simple, complex, compound, and compound complex. So breaking it down into these different things. And these are all my equivalences, effectively. I was testing the comparability. I was like, okay, questions are a feature, but are they similar in this way? Are they similar in this way? Are they similar in this way? And within that, I had this little tricky bit of trying to figure out, okay, are they indirect or direct, and how do I get there? So what did I do? What I did was I started with these WH complements, relative pronouns, if conjunctions, question words, etc. I throw the literature, and I found all of these different ways that people might be able to raise questions. So things like what, qu'est-ce que, in Spanish and qu'est-ce que in French. And then what I did was I searched for each one of these words. So lots and lots of searches, and it pulled down thousands of concordance lines. And for each form that I identified, I made a sample, a random sample that was about 95% confidence interval. So the idea was to kind of use a population technique to decide on the number of concordance lines that I would need to analyze in order to be able to decide what was in there. And really, the main point of this was not to identify indirect questions, but to identify what is being done to raise indirect questions. So I analyzed these samples, and I identified anything that could be an indirect question. For this wasn't necessarily always very easy. Sometimes it was, so it might be something like, the question arises as to whether or not So that's pretty straightforward. But other times, what needed to be done was that I needed to look within the text itself. So I might have to go a couple of sections ahead. Sometimes I might have to go to the conclusion to see, are they actually answering this question? So it needed to be related to what's happening within the text. And so what I did was I pulled all that out. But at that point, what I had was a list of words that were formally related to question words. And again, that was quite close in terms of what I could potentially be looking for. So what I did was I looked at the words used in conjunction with these particular question forms and that were used to help raise these indirect questions. So I kind of dug a little bit more deeply into them, and I found words like ask or se demander or questionar. And then again, I thought, okay, this is a nice list of words, but is that far enough for me to be able to say that I feel like I really kind of thoroughly unpacked these forms and I'm not being too driven by form? And so to identify the questions I'm not constrained by form, or not constrained too much by form, really, because we're always going to be constrained by form when we're popping this into a search in a Corpus software. But what I did was I looked for all verb, adverb, adjective, noun forms and inflections related to words. So I might look for the noun question, the verb to question, adjective question, questionable, etc. So I looked for all of these for every single word that I'd found in my initial searches. And I did the same thing again. This time I did samples where I broke it down to 95% intervals again and pulled out large sets of concordance lines and analyzed each one of those manually. And then basically based on that, I was able to extract a bunch of questions, and it was exhausting. It took forever. which I think is probably something that you could do as part of a PhD because you have the time to be able to do something like that. But really what that involved was a very, very heavy manual analysis, digging into the text and looking at all of this work, that all the kind of the context around it, that spans much further than what you get in 100 characters on either side in a concordance software, corpus analysis software. Also, as part of this, one of the challenges with this type of work, and that I think we have to figure out ways of being able to address within our field, is ideas related to interrater reliability. Because how do you do interrater reliability for something like this? I don't think I have a friend who's good enough in the world to dive into this. Yeah. And so what I ended up having to do with this was I did intra-rater reliability. So I left this all alone, I went and did something else, and then a couple of months later I redid it. So I ended up doing this approach twice, where I redid the analysis to see whether or not I was coming to the same conclusions. And so with that, I was able to, along the way, I kept my searches, I kept the things I extracted to see whether I agreed, and I was able to kind of come to a general understanding of what I'm constituting as this particular approach. So what did I find? You might be wondering, like, goodness, is this worth it at all? Why do all of this? And in some ways you might look at it and think, no, it wasn't worth it, at least you know. So within each subcorpus, what did I find? I found that indirect questions were quite a feature, right? So that's good, because I would have missed that completely if I just focused on question marks. And then as we dig into these other kind of variables that maybe influence the form, function, etc. of these questions, we get a little bit more insight into what's going on with them. Overall, direct questions are more common, but we do see them as a key feature. And when we look in French, for example, proportionally, it makes up for a greater percentage than in other languages. When we look at the forms, what we see is nouns are used somewhat, adjectives somewhat, and verbs then somewhat again. Verbs were the most common form used in the analysis, or in the use of the use of indirect questions. So generally nouns emerge as somewhat important, and you see things like question words being used. So question, the investigation, test, or the word question, the noun question in French, or in Spanish, cuestión, pregunta, things like that. So these kind of question words being used to kind of evoke indirect questions, which is, I guess, what we might expect in terms of the kind of forms that we would look for. When we think about adjectives, we find that they're not so common, really. The kind of use of it's not clear whether, or in Spanish, resulta cuestionable, so it's questionable in this sense. So you might wonder, why bother do this for small returns and something like adjectives? And I think that this is quite a small study, so it's like looking at a small corpus in this sense. But why I think this matters is that two things. I can say for certain that they're not a feature, whereas before I couldn't really say that. I wouldn't know, right? I wouldn't really know if adjectives were doing anything in this regard. I wouldn't know what I'm missing. And the other thing is that often when and I'll show you as I dug a little bit more deeply into it and talked about function, with the particular forms that are used, different kinds of indirect questions were being used to raise particular functions. And so what you might see is that although there might be lots of small frequencies of forms being used to raise questions, that they converge around particular functional elements that they're performing. And basically, I think what that shows us is that if we search for form, we'll get these kind of large form retrievals. But if we're looking for meaning, it might actually be adding lots of small bits of information together to get how people are performing particular meanings. And if we don't look for function, we could miss that entirely, which I think is an important factor. When it comes to verbs, interrogative verbs were highly frequent, so things like ask, interroger, preguntar, and we have things like investigate, and we see kind of correspondences across these languages too in terms of shared ones, but also some ways in which they differ from one another as well. And maybe you can't really see this here, but I'll share the slides around so you can see the examples. But in this case, you might have things like and ask whether there are trends. So the question there is asking whether something is happening and then we have some examples here. I've put translations up in French. So if these results were to be confirmed, however, it would be legitimate to wonder whether this is happening. So again, raising an indirect question. it seems interesting to return to the foundations of the consumer and to question it in life. So in this case, the question it is not necessarily coming with the WH element, some kind of question element. It's just using the verb itself. And in Spanish, of these main United States, and we must seriously ask ourselves of the globalization process. Again, so it's like a self-reflexive question. So verbs are quite common and often using kind of interrogative verbs. We see other kinds of verbs emerging there as well that are used to ask questions. So different kind of forms that are kind of needed in order to be able to do that. And so then I was able to kind of embed all of that within this wider study and think a little bit about what form was doing in terms of the question type in this analysis of the questions. And when you look at that, basically what I found was that questions were a core feature across all languages, but there may be a significant difference between English and Spanish, but as we go across all three, relatively comparable. And as I tried to think a little bit about what these questions were doing in each language, I was able to say that they use similar functions, that the questions are similar in length, or in English and Spanish, but shorter in French. That all languages use mostly direct questions. French uses mainly indirect questions, or not mainly, uses the most indirect questions rather. English and Spanish use mainly content questions, while French uses mainly polar questions. And then we get this kind of sense of the kind of verbs used to be able to raise questions that are frequent in each language. And some things that don't necessarily compare, like in the precisar in Spanish, they like to make something precise in a way. And this was kind of like a non-point really, that most questions occur in the middle section because it was the largest section. So that wasn't particularly interesting. But what this allowed me to do was to be able to kind of be certain about whether or not I was capturing enough information to be able to make these claims about how the languages compare to one another. One of the things that you see in literature in contrastive linguistics is that often they're quite Anglocentric in terms of their focus. So the norms that are applied to other languages come from English language norms, and notions of reader friendliness, reader engagement, etc., focus specifically on the kind of things that we think are good in English. But when we look across languages, we see that actually there's quite a lot happening indirectly as well, and this will account for ways in which writers are engaging readers and including them in the texts, effectively creating reader-oriented texts. Typically, French and Spanish are seen to be not reader-oriented languages, but I think when we look in both direct and indirect questions, I think that's quite questionable in itself. So by bringing this kind of focus on function to form retrieval, I was able to maybe question a little bit more these Anglocentric perspectives about what constitutes a reader-friendly language or not. So this was, I guess, the first half of the study. And what I did then was I reinterrogated that same study. I looked at all those same questions and I categorized them according to function. And within each function, I applied the same critique. So I thought about how frequent is this function, what about question length, what about question type and form, etc. And then what this did reveal were interesting differences in particular things in type. I'm not going to be able to talk about all of that in detail, so if you want to read more about any of that, you'll find it in my book about it, but because function is really the main focus of the book. But what I did find, I should say before I move on, is that this particular focus, for example, questions that were used to frame discourses are often questions that are used to kind of give us research questions at the beginning of texts or maybe sometimes in the middle of texts. And that question function in English used mainly indirect questions in economics. So quite a lot of indirect questions, quite long questions used to be able to set up the nature and focus of a particular study. And so we were able to kind of see comparable elements. That wasn't the case at all in French and Spanish, whereas in French, for example, it was mainly direct questions and polar questions being used. So as we dug a little bit more deeply, we can see the questions that we raise, our approach to raising questions around research, our approach to kind of framing research that we're doing is very different and relies on different degrees of explicitness, implicitness, and different degrees of directness, or also in terms of content focus as well. So things like yes, no questions versus content questions. So what does this mean? I think generally we're limited by form in corpus linguistics. we're always searching for form and we're finding form. And I think this is risky at times because what we may be missing is lots of small ways in which we use language to perform similar functions. So when we start to maybe look at things from a functional perspective and grouping things under that banner, we might be able to get a different sense of how this information quantitatively is distributed within corpora and within texts. But I don't really think we can avoid it. I think it's part and parcel of the field. What we can do is think about ways that we can work around forms. So we can look at ways that we're trying not to be too led by forms, be self-critical of whether or not what we're getting is actually reflective of what we're trying to say or talk about, or are the things that we're potentially missing because we're looking for very specific forms. Within the study, then, the way I approached that was by thinking beyond the field of corpus linguistics and looking beyond corpus pragmatics even to thinking about areas of pragmatics, thinking, for example, at looking at elocutionary force indicating devices, but also looking at fields that have dealt with similar problems. So in this case, contrastive linguistics, which literally kind of fell from the face of the earth in the 1980s because of methodological weaknesses associated with this exact issue. And so the kind of return of contrastive linguistics has been at the kind of effort to address this methodological circularity. So we don't really have to start from scratch. We need to draw things in from other spaces and figure out how we can inform our methodological approaches. I think at the end of the day, we might wonder, is all of this work really worth that? Is it really worth doing this level of coding, etc.? And I think ultimately it depends on what we care about and what we're doing. So if our study is interested in form, then I guess that maybe we don't need to do something like this. But if what we're interested in talking about is language use and function, and we don't want to be constrained by particular formal searches, then I think we have to find little ways to work around these type of texts. And so this was my approach to it, painstaking as it was. So thank you very much. I hope that was helpful. And
Thank you, that was really interesting. I had two quite short questions. One was about the middle bits of the text where you said I had the most questions. Is that because you counted them, or is it sort of occurrences per million words as well, or sort of standardized?
Yes, so well, to that it was to do with so what I used the kind of coding scheme that they developed in Vlotta et al, and with that basically sections that were marked as an introduction were marked as and coded as an introduction, sections that were marked as a conclusion were coded as a conclusion, and everything else became the middle section.
Right.
So those sections tended to be quite large. So at the macro it wasn't particularly helpful actually as a sectioning tool, but once it came to the functional analysis, the things that fell into the introduction and conclusion was quite interesting, because what you'd see is that certain questions were kind of happening more frequently in there, even though they were much smaller spaces. So these kind of were spaces in which these kind of questions were raised. But the middle was a bit of a black box, so not necessarily very revealing. So yeah.
Okay, and thanks. The other one was, you said you couldn't find a friend who would give you. But I wondered, like, could you use something like ChatGPT to do that kind of code?
I mean, it would be interesting to test. I mean, with this kind of thing, well, we've worked on a little paper on this I guess kind of replicating this study with ChatGPT to see if it would code these things very well. Not very well, no. Well, because yeah, we tried. Myself, Gavin, and Paul have tried looking at this in different ways.
Oh, this is your friend in the audience.
My friend in the audience. I didn't actually anticipate the question. I should have. But with this, what we found, for example, is that had different degrees of success when dealing with different amounts of context, and actually less context, it was better. So when it looked at keywords, it was better at categorizing things. But once you had concordance lines or full extracted text, it did kind of unusual things, for example, making up questions that weren't even in the data to begin with and interpreting things in strange ways. So I'm not sure that it will solve the problem, as it were.
It's 3.5 or 4.
Which one?
3.5 or 4.
Oh, 4. Yeah.
So-called hallucination.
Yeah.
Thanks.
If there are any questions online, any other questions? Eleanor.
Yeah, I was wondering, so do you see the things that you identified by using this method, do you see them all as performing the same speech act?
In the things that I identified, I saw them more as ways in to looking for questions. So So what I tried to do was be as broad as possible and open to different kinds of forms that could be used to frame or raise questions in some way, and also conceptualizing the question as quite broadly as this notion of a concealed question. In terms of what they're doing, at a kind of a zoomed out level, yes, I suppose that we could think of these particular words as being part of, but not solely, because often it's maybe a couple of words coming together, a phrase, but also not always, being a form of illocutionary force indicating device for raising indirect questions. And then within that, then you can look in and you can see that they're performing different functions as you categorize those functions rhetorically. But at a macro kind of zooming out perspective, that they would be serving to raise questions, though not always. Obviously, they use these words in lots of ways that don't raise questions. So you need to be able to look around in the context, the text to be able to do that.
Okay. Yeah, because question is not quite a speech ag.
Yeah.
Requesting.
Yes.
Speech
Yeah.
ag,
Yeah.
etc.
Well, because I think in the case of the academic text, it's really more like about rhetoric than anything, because the questions are often not really doing anything to raise questions. They're often serving to organize a text, to critique something, to
and questionable is not really a question.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So it's in the sense of like a rhetorical question that's being used to be able to serve some other kind of reader engagement function.
I suppose in a way that sort of goes back to your earlier point about the square and the rectangle. Different optics give you different interpretations of the data. So with that one, to what extent do you think that you should, in advance of looking at the text, decide in a principled way whether you're interested in form or function principle? The reason I ask that could be that you could end up with a version of p-value hacking for linguistics. You look at form, you don't get an answer. So you look at function, you get an answer, and then you decide the function is the thing you should have looked at. So in other words, you carry on digging until you find something that looks relevant, significant.
Yeah.
But in the first instance, that wasn't your hypothesis.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess, I mean, for me, that was all part of the process in a way. I initially didn't necessarily know how I was going to approach this, and as I dug into the data and unpacked it more, I found things that I thought were doing what I was looking for, but I wasn't necessarily sure that I was getting everything that I could get. I still don't think I did. I'm sure I missed plenty of things because you're so formally constrained. So I think probably, as with most things in a Corpus study, it's not really about having a predetermined kind of this is what I'm going to do, but iteratively kind of redeveloping your approach based on what it is that you're trying to achieve. So aligning with your research goals. In this case, it was important because I wasn't sure whether different languages would approach this differently, and I didn't want to fall into the trap of applying Anglocentric norms about question raising, etc., to other languages. And so what I wanted to do was remain open and uncertain and kind of reflexive as possible until I was able to pull out things that I could make sense of that were performing this kind of function. And in doing that, what I ended up with was getting everything I'd get if I did just search for form, which is the question words and the question marks, but I also got much more.
I wonder, you see, whether in fact what we should say is function should be our dominant view of the text. Right. Form is accessible, but in fact form is a way through to function.
Yes, yeah.
And actually we should expect to see more significant, in a non-statistical sense,
yes,
but more significant results at the level of function, because we have a process of aggregation going on, and the aggregation is principled linguistically.
Yes.
So we're saying there are these categories, and our individual examples go into the smaller number of categories.
Exactly.
So actually we're then forcing equivalence between examples in a principled way.
Yeah.
And that's more likely to show you big differences because you're getting that aggregation effect.
Yeah.
And so things which are scattered around with frequencies of 1 or 2 are suddenly coming together.
Exactly. Yeah, absolutely. Because the forms may be, like, as you said, lots of different small forms being used to be able to do very similar things. And as you bring them together under certain categories, you can see actually quite significant differences. It's about perspective.
It looks like you find.
Yes, indeed. Yeah. As you look across function, for example, you find lots of variation in the types of questions being used. And I think that has an impact in how we maybe approach the framing and dissemination of knowledge, and how we question knowledge and critique knowledge, etc., differently in different languages.
I suppose then that falls back onto Owen's question about which categories.
Yeah,
Because depending on which categories you choose, you'll aggregate in different ways.
absolutely. Yeah.
Sorry, I'm enjoying a private chat here. Has anybody else got any, or are there any questions online? Any questions from goodly folk in the audience? Luke.
Hi, Niall. Thanks very much. I had some. I was interested in your thoughts about the adjectival component, given that it was particularly frequent. But it seemed to me, just based on my English knowledge, that it could be used quite strategically to be particularly devastating. In the value sense.
Right, exactly.
So, what were your thoughts on when it was being used? Whether it was doing something else that you wouldn't be able to achieve in sort of now?
Well, your intuition is right there in that I didn't find very many, but the ones that I did find were largely used for critique. So it was a way of being able to critique other people's studies. So one of the categories was expressing criticism and counterclaims, and often I think in all the cases for the adjectives that I found, that was how they were being used. So you're right. I think the kind of that formal element in terms of adjectives and evaluation.
So would they be more potent if used less frequently?
But, or yes, potentially, or maybe it's a genre thing. So maybe it's not something that we'll necessarily see in research articles. But if we were to look at other forms of like academic dissemination, like blogs, you might see something different happening there because it may be a formality, a register,
and a feigned objectivity.
Yeah, exactly. It is often about obscuring. So you see kind of the indirect one, the indirect questions often being used to obscure questions and critique. So not necessarily having them be too direct. Whereas maybe some of the direct questions are maybe more used in organizational ways, for example, to sequence information, raise a question and then answer it.
You have Julian's D at one point on one of your slides, and I was wondering about the dispersion of some of these features, whether in fact there are certain authors who have styles.
There was the odd, very infrequent, but there were some that were skewing for sure, that had a large number of questions used, but generally they were pretty evenly dispersed. I'm trying to remember the range exactly, but I think it was around 70%. I think 70% was the lower end for Spanish. 70% of the text contained questions.
That's true with both perspectives. If you look at the forms and the functions.
Yes, yeah, indeed. So the questions were, I think the use of questions was pretty mirrored across the languages as well. I think as you got to the lower frequency ones, there may have been slightly ranked differently, but there was negligible difference between them really. So it tended to follow the same pattern. That's why I did that second phase of the study, because the first phase kind of established that actually the functions are pretty comparable. They're doing, which is something you might not have expected. If you're looking across languages, you might expect them to be doing very different things, but actually they weren't. It was very similar. And so then as I dug into that, then it kind of revealed further differences at like a formal and level or in terms of question type, etc.
My last comment then, if nobody else has one. Of course, you're looking at three very similar languages. Yeah. What do you think would happen if you threw in Chinese?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, you're right in that a lot of the kind of areas of contrastive linguistics has focused in these languages that are relatively comparable, partly because what you're trying to do is have something quite comparable. I think if you wanted to bring in a language like Chinese to be able to compare against these, against English or against other languages, you would have to think a little bit about forms, for example, and how we might be able to constitute and name and label forms in a comparable way. And if you're using the like part of speech tagging, for example, as part of your comparison, like can you reasonably compare the way in which things are tagged, whether it's by character, whether it's by word, and so on. So there are different kind of challenges when you bring in languages that maybe have different scripts or different approaches. And what you always need to do is just try and factor in the variables, because if you understand the variables and try and minimize them, then the conclusion you can draw is meaningful. But if you compare apples and oranges and find that they're different, it's not a particularly exciting finding.
I'll be your friend in the audience again then. Any examples you have of that work you're doing?
Well, yes, in that we're working on a project with Korean learner data and turning that
people learning Korean.
Yeah, people learning Korean and turning that corpus and those texts into a corpus and maintaining script issues and tagging all of that has been bit of a challenge, but I think we've got there and we can get into the text now, which is pretty good. But yeah, so it can be a bit of a challenge technically to kind of make all of that work so that way you can retrieve things. So it may be that we need to kind of reconsider ways in and approaches as we work with different languages because of the way that they're formally constructed, and it just needs to be kind of iteratively developed, I think.
Just check one last time. We've got friends online. There are no questions from them.
Nope.
Okay. We did offer you the chance, folks. If there are no questions. Oh, sorry, there is one. My apologies. I missed you.
Sorry, I just raised my hand now. So I was just wondering, because you've identified that questions don't have several functions from Highland's framework. And from your data, it suggests that like we see this more in English than French and Spanish. Is it possible, and in your data, have you seen that like is French or Spanish using a different form
Very
to
good
actually to get to that function?
It's a very good question. So I didn't talk about that here, but it will be in the book. I don't think it's in the paper. Within contrastive linguistics is a directional issue in terms of how you operate your studies. So typically we might categorize them as two ways. One would be convergent and one is divergent. And if it's convergent, the notion is, okay, we've got questions, bring them together and let's see how questions compare. And what that study tells us is how questions compare to each other. It doesn't tell us about everything that could be happening within the language. Another thing we could do is we could say, okay, questions in English, this is what they're doing. What's doing the same thing in French? What's doing the same thing in Spanish? And we might find that it's not questions performing that function whatsoever. It could be some kind of stance marker. It could be other kinds of engagement markers, personal asides, etc. And so it is a directional issue. And that's another kind of factor you have to take in. What does the way that you've constructed the comparison, how does that limit what you can say? But often what you find with contrastive studies is what you can say is very small, but if you do it, then you can say it, you know, you can be quite certain of what you found, but what you found is often quite small because you need to really limit the variables. Otherwise, it starts to be meaningless.
Oh, one more, Lily.
In terms of comparability, do you know like if they Spanish, French, and English, they have the same like similar publishing conventions? It might be like they are different.
Yes. So what I can say is that they don't necessarily. In 2004, Swales wrote a paper. I think he called it Tyrannosaurus Rex or something like that. It was about the English language and saying basically that the English language is incomparable to other languages owing to its position in the world, owing to the users, owing to its makeup of speakers, owing to the ways in which it's used in lots of different domains. And when we look at languages like French and Spanish, we tend to see them being used in these contexts, at least in a more national way. So it's often people publishing in national context, maybe producing research for policy or government-oriented things, and then producing similar research in English for different spaces as well. So they are very different. And so what I needed to do, and that's why I focused specifically on economics, specifically on a certain type of economics, and I constituted the corpus by thinking about, okay, research articles that are peer-reviewed, that contain this kind of information, that are produced for this particular purpose, and thinking, Batia talks about disciplinary genres and thinking about how we think about them as a communicative act, and I try to align the communicative act of the text that I was choosing. So are they performing a similar communicative act to the ones that are happening in French and Spanish? So it involved a lot of searching and then a lot of exclusion of texts that wouldn't necessarily fit the criteria.
Another question. Did you find like maybe one questions they perform like different functions, like not only one function?
Good question. So with the functions, the way that I approached that was quite, again, everything quite iterative. So it was kind of like reshaping by the text. And so what I did was I tried to set boundaries between what the questions were doing in order to be able to avoid overlap. So I could say, for example, with questions that were framing the discourse and organizing the text, initially in kind of a broad sense, they were kind of working in quite a similar way. And then as I tried to maybe disentangle them, I added a bit more detail, and that'll be in the book in terms of like how like how I defined each question and how I compared or contrasted it to the others. So within that, for example, questions that organize the text, questions that would sequence information. So it wouldn't set up larger claims, but it would be raising a question and then moving on to the next paragraph to address that question as a way of moving information along. Whereas framing the discourse was broader. It was about setting things up as an overarching claim that they wanted to be able to interrogate in some way. So and kind of redevelop the definitions of the questions based on the texts. And partly I did that because I used Highlands from like as an outset, and I modified it slightly. So the question functions don't align exactly to Highland. And that's partly because I wanted to be open to questions working differently in different languages. And I wasn't certain that the framework developed for the analysis of English would work just as mapped on French and Spanish. So I kind of modified it as I went along.
Okay. In that case now, thank you for leaving us so much time for questions. We have them. And thank you very much for an interesting talk. Thank you.
No worries.